We'll get things kicked off with the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Before we get to the rest of the ACC, we're going to lump Notre Dame in right here. And as you look through the teams that we're going to go through in the ACC and the Big 12, the numbers that you saw in the SEC and the numbers that you saw in the Big 10 aren't going to be reflected in some of these other leagues. Why? Because I don't think these leagues have as good of a chance to get an at-large bid as some of the leagues that we've already talked about, the Big Ten and the SEC primarily. Of course, Notre Dame, their only pathway to make the college football playoff is by way of the at-large. So it is very much dependent on the decision that's made by the college football playoff executive panel. Is it going to be 6 automatic qualifiers or is it going to be 7 automatic qualifiers? One less spot means lowers the chances for the Irish, but I love the team they bring back. Marcus Freeman enters year number 3, which I think, people have kind of had question marks about his process. Maybe there were moments last year where they didn't play as well. The Louisville game stands out. The Clemson game stands out. But there were some really good moments last year as well. The USC game was a resounding victory. There was a lot of positives to take away from year number 2, even though most people will look at the year that they had Sam Hartman and say that was a missed opportunity. Sure, they also took Ohio State to the brink. I think they had a lot of really good moments, and there was progress made from year 1 under Marcus Freeman to year 2. I also think they've made a significant addition in bringing back Mike Denbrock, who's going to be the offensive coordinator. He was at LSU, and the job he did with Jaden Daniels and the job he did with that offense as a whole was pretty remarkable. Any losses that LSU experienced last year were certainly not because of their performance on that side of the ball. So Mike Denbrock being back at Notre Dame is massive. Another massive coup was bringing in Riley Leonard, including, all of his experience, I think is massive. Now, let's be real for a second. I look at Riley Leonard, I think he's got a really high ceiling. The problem is I don't think he's anywhere near where he can be. And this is going to happen with downfield accuracy. Accuracy on throws that travel 10 or more yards downfield. If you look at Riley Leonard, he's not an inaccurate player, but the consistency on the downfield throws just isn't there. And part of that had to do with what he was asked to do at Duke. He was asked to rely a lot on his legs, especially against top competition, a la Clemson week 1. If you watch him, he's getting the ball out really quickly because his offensive line at that time, they weren't sure how they were going to gel. So they asked their quarterback, hey, get the ball out. Don't let this defensive line, don't let this pass rush for Clemson get home. So he was getting the ball out, and then he kind of got hurt. And so it's tough to evaluate the 23 season for Riley Leonard, but I think there's a lot left in the tank. It's just, can he get there? That's a big question. Because if you actually look at what Mike Denbrock did with Jaden Daniels had really good moments early in his career at Arizona State. Now, he was inconsistent, but he always had wheels. Well, Riley Leonard's always had wheels, but there have been a lot of moments of inconsistency. So hopefully Mike Denbrock can accelerate the development of Riley Leonard, and he can look a little bit more like Jaden Daniels, who brought home the Heisman Trophy last year. That would be tremendous. I thought there were some significant losses on the roster. When I look back, and I guess we just haven't spent enough time on Notre Dame, there are a lot of departures off this team, but there's a lot of guys back that have played high-quality football. Some of the notables, though, Sam Hartman's gone at quarterback. Joe Alt going to be a top 5, top 10 pick at worst in the NFL draft at left tackle. Blake Fisher, who was at right tackle last year, very inconsistent at times last year, didn't play, I think, his best football, but he's out as well. J.D. Bertrand, rock-solid middle linebacker. Him being gone is significant. He's the signal caller and meant a lot to that team. And then you lose Maris Liufau as well. So him being out, a couple of guys at the second level that I do think will be difficult to replace, but I think they have adequate reinforcements coming there at the linebacker core. Audric Estime, of course, is massive as well, but I think they're deep at running back. So that one is not going to concern me overly, at least right now. Here's the ones that bother me, okay? Chris Tyree transferring to Virginia. That one's massive. He was, at times, outside of Estime and Mitchell Evans, he was their most dynamic playmaker. Holden Stays, their most dynamic tight end at times last year. I think he was somewhat underutilized. He's now transferring to Tennessee, where I'm sure he's hoping to catch a few more passes in that little bit more pass-happy attack. Rico Flores transferred to UCLA. They were very high on him. He had a lot of juice. He was young, obviously, but now him leaving, they lose the potential juice on the outside with Rico Flores. Tobias Merriweather was another guy that they really liked. He's transferring to Cal. Braylon James is out. Their center Zeke Correll is out. And Ramon Henderson is a really good cover safety. He transferred to UCLA as well. So there was quite a bit of turnover, especially at wide receiver. And I look at the wide receivers that were brought in. I'm not doubting that they have decent players at wideout. They still bring back Jaden Thomas. They still bring back Jordan Faison, who I think has got a chance to be a really good slot receiver. And then Jaden Greathouse is back. Now he's a sophomore, hopefully a little bit more advanced in his development. Mitchell Evans will return from the knee injury. And Eli Raridan, who was sidelined most of the beginning of last year. He's 6'6" and can run. And there at tight end, that's a really nice 1-2 punch. I mentioned the running back depth. They should be good there. Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price, they're going to be just fine. I'm not going to lose any sleep about running backs, and they did add a couple pieces in the portal, including FIU's Chris Mitchell, who went for over 1,100 yards last year. Then you get Bo Collins from Clemson, who I think is solid but unspectacular, and Jaden Harrison, who's a wide receiver from Marshall. We'll be curious to see how those guys factor in to kind of spell Thomas, Faison, and Greathouse, who are likely to be the starters. On the defensive side, should be pretty solid. Howard Cross and Riley Mills return up front. Riley Mills, I think, really came into his own as the season went along, and Howard Cross has progressively improved. Even though he's undersized, he's very difficult to contain. The addition of R.J. Oben at defensive end from Duke was big. And then Rod Hurd, I think, rounds out. He's the transfer from Northwestern. He plays kind of a slot, nickel, can play safety. I think Rod Hurd's a really good player, by the way. They also brought in Jordan Clark from Arizona State. I think this safety has a chance to be elite. Big-time elite. You got 2 All-American candidates. One was an All-American last year in Xavier Watts. Then you have a freshman All-American from 2 years ago in Benjamin Morrison. So I think their secondary has a chance to be among the nation's best. And then in the front end of that secondary, you'll get Jalen Sneed, who's extremely athletic and poised for a big year, and Jack Kaiser to kind of be the 1-2 punch there at linebacker. So I think they are really solid from top to bottom. Will they be as deep as they were a year ago? That's a legitimate question, but I think they're in really good shape. The one question mark remains is the wide receiver position. That was the question mark last year, and I think depth along the defensive line is something I'll be trying to identify a little bit earlier as well. There's a couple guys that have played, Burnham, Botello, a couple others too, so they should be okay. It's just I don't know if they're going to be quite as disruptive as they were at times last year. Let's look at the schedule. At A&M, very tricky game to start things off. I think that's a toss-up. You go on the road and win against your former defensive coordinator. That's a big one. Duke played Notre Dame really well last year. We all know who the head coach was at Duke last year. So that'll be a tricky one, I think, to come out of the gate there, especially in August. It's going to be 1 billion degrees depending on what time is kicked. That thing could be 1 billion degrees there. At 3:30 in the afternoon, if that's when it's kicking off, it's going to be a scorcher there in Kyle Field. NIU at Purdue. I think at Purdue is going to be a tricky one. I lean Notre Dame pretty heavily, but that is a game that is certainly one that you need to be a little careful with. Then you get to the middle part of your schedule. They're late September, all the way through middle of October. Miami, Ohio, Louisville, and Stanford, they're all at home. I know Louisville got them last year, and Louisville has adequately reinforced some of the pieces that they lost. But I don't know, man. Going into Notre Dame, when that's probably been a revenge game circled for the Irish, I have a hard time envisioning them getting this one. So worst case scenario right now, you got 1, maybe 2 losses. I think it's very possible, too, that going into the game on the road at Georgia Tech on October 19th, you're sitting there at 5-0 or 6-0. At Georgia Tech, well, it'd be a tricky game. You look at Georgia Tech, they got great team speed. I think they're going to be a lot better this year. They're going to be that disruptive piece there in the ACC with Haynes King. They have elite speed at wide receiver. They have elite speed at running back. That's a team that you need to be very, very careful with. So be careful on October 19th when you travel to Atlanta. Navy, Florida State comes to you, Virginia, and then you go to USC in the final week of the season to play the USC Trojans. I'm thinking right now 9-3. For the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Some people on this show, named Mark Kubiak, think 10-2 is the floor. I think that's a little bit presumptuous because we have seen Notre Dame lose games they shouldn't lose in the past. I think their odds of making the playoff in 2023, especially not knowing exactly what the playoff format's going to look like, is around 40%, which, by the way, is pretty dang good. I know people are going to say that's not good. I think that's actually pretty good. I really do, especially with the non-conference road game. Obviously, everything's non-conference, but a road game to A&M early and a couple other tricky road games like Georgia Tech, Purdue, and then at SC with Florida State coming to you. So I think 9-3 is about right. I could see 10-2, but I don't think 10-2 guarantees you a spot. I think in all likelihood, you go 10-2, you're in a really good chance to potentially get to the 12-team playoff.